Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of my new series, Psychology Unbound. My name is Moon, and today we'll be doing a breakdown on the beloved character of AMC's The Walking Dead, Daryl Dixon. The background I have for wanting to create a series like this is that I have earned a bachelor's in both writing and psychology on top of being a lead in my college research team for 3 semesters. Shout out Team 12. So, I figure I'm qualified enough to put 5 years of college to the test by breaking down fan favorite characters from all forms of media. And for our first episode, there is no one better to kick off this series than Daryl Dixon. Before we get into the thick of it, it's important to give credit to where it's due. Portrayed by Norman Reedus, who rose to fame through his roles in Boondock Saints and American Gangster, and also as an avid painter and creator, Norman became a popular name around the dinner table through his collaboration with AMC in bringing Daryl Dixon to life. Daryl's origins are unique to Norman and his first audition for the show. As I'm sure some of you are aware, Daryl is an original character made for the TV version of Robert Kirkman's The Walking Dead when it first premiered. What you may not know is that Daryl was specifically created for Norman Reedus after his audition for Merle Dixon, who was later given to Michael Rooker. Initially, Daryl was planned to be killed off in the early seasons, but he stuck around due to the roaring cry of fans wanting to see more of the character. I mean, can you blame them? There's a reason why moms around the globe thirst after this man. First introduced in Season 1, Episode 3, Tell It to the Frogs, Daryl Dixon stumbles onto the scene as a wild hunter and brother to the maniac Merle, who our main cast would quickly side against. Soon after his introduction, Merle would be handcuffed on top of a skyscraper in the city of Atlanta. He was left with a fighting chance, but not many options to free himself. Daryl and the crew return to find Merle's amputated hand atop the skyscraper. After this, Daryl joins Rick and his crew of survivors, becoming an essential fighter in the group and leaving the broken down city of Atlanta on his brother's motorcycle. Years later, Norman would have his own spin-off series where he finds himself over in Paris. Yes, Paris. Remember when the show was a little rinky-dink thing where the characters were still looking for a cure by going to the CDC? Well, now there are mutant zombies and government conspiracies. Something I would have to get into much more detail about in a totally separate series. But my question to the series is this: how realistic is Daryl's character? What would happen if the same circumstances were to occur to a human being in the real world? Our world. What can a zombie apocalypse do to the psyche of a human? Let's turn to psychology to find out. Before we begin our quick summary, here are a few trigger warnings. There will be mentions of abuse, racism, mental health, and drug use. So, who is Daryl Dixon truly? In Season 1, we get a small look into his history before the apocalypse, thanks to his and Merle's relationship. Growing up in the Appalachian Mountains of northern Georgia, Daryl and his older brother lived with their abusive father, Will, who frequently turned to drinking to face life's daily challenges. Mother Dixon would also neglect her children, but would meet an untimely end due to a house fire caused by a lit cigarette. Despite his abrasive attitude, Merle was the primary caretaker of Daryl when their father failed to live up to his role. Even in the zombie apocalypse, Merle was the foundation for Daryl to keep moving forward, and often a harsh contrast between what was right and what was wrong. As a kid, Merle was often serving time in prison or a juvie, leaving Daryl alone with his father. This tough upbringing led Daryl to be self-sufficient because he had to fend for himself. Another fact about the two is that for money, he and his brother would sell drugs and work as mechanics. Merle would even sell Daryl's blood for cash just so they can get by pre-apocalypse. At the time of his introduction, Daryl is a dangerous loose cannon. Season 2 strengthens Daryl's commitment to the group as he begins his search for the missing. Sophia! He introduces the infamous Breaking Bad Easter egg where he saves T-Dog's life by getting antibiotics for an infection using Merle's old stash of drugs. In Season 2, Episode 3, Save the Last One, we receive our next big lore drop with his conversation with Andrea. Soon after his mother's death, Daryl loses himself in the woods for 9 days, having to survive without food or shelter. He would admit to eating wild berries during this time and even use poison oak as toilet paper while out there. Talk about a pain in the butt, right? But too soon? When Daryl came back after this missing period, his father didn't even notice. Later in Season 2, Daryl would be faced with a serious head wound after tumbling down a cliff after a fight with walkers. This would lead to a series of hallucinations where Daryl would have visions of Merle, providing us with more evidence to show our hero's tragic lack of self-love. A major event that would shape Daryl's self-image would be the incident involving him, Merle, and Merle's drug supplier pre-apocalypse. After a heated argument with Merle and the supplier, Daryl steps in and savagely begins to beat the man. The tide turns when the supplier threatens to shoot Daryl. After being punched in the gut and a continued beating, a shamed Daryl watches as the supplier and his brother laugh off the incident. With this near-death experience, Daryl finds his status in the group as someone without value or purpose in life. Facing a similar feeling with the survivors, Daryl hits a low point after this incident with hallucinations. That is, until Carol steps in and reminds him that someone does care about him with a kiss on the forehead, thus bonding the two even further. The highlight of trauma for Daryl in Season 3 would be the death of his brother Merle. As we get to Season 4, Daryl's character grows in a major way as he earns himself a leadership role. We get to see him open up and see more of his social side, which brings us to Daryl's social nature. Pre-apocalypse, the Dixon family had some less than progressive views about the world. Now, as a reminder, it's important to note the separation between character and actor here. A character's views and beliefs do not reflect the actor's personal beliefs. With that said, let's get into the muck of the Dixon ideology. Merle's bike can be spotted with the Nazi insignia displayed on his fuel tank, which Daryl takes over the majority of Seasons 1 and 2. Daryl also makes quite a few jokes about Glenn and his Korean heritage before they grow closer. Despite his harsh introduction to Rick and his group, Daryl becomes a fundamental character, being an emotional shoulder for characters to rely on and a father figure for the children of, well, pretty much every community he goes to, if we're being honest here. He overcomes any negative views that his family ingrained in him. Daryl cooperates with the group and even shows signs of respect and care to the members of his growing community. After the whole Sophia incident, he learns that his brother's way of thinking isn't the way to survive in this world, as he heavily relates to the trauma and abuse that Carol has gone through. He is often the first to volunteer to save characters in danger and is frequently in positions of power, such as being in the prison council in Season 4. This growth is exemplified later in the season after the prison falls. When he and Beth are stuck with each other in Season 4, Episode 12, Still, the two of them have an argument that leads to an emotional scene, revealing that he blames himself for the death of Herschel and the downfall of the prison by not looking for the governor with Michonne. In a fiery burst of revenge against the trauma of the past, he and Beth burn down the cabin they take shelter in, as it reminds him of his childhood home. Season 5 has our heroes dealing with Terminus, and its finale, Beth departs from the show with her dramatic death. As we move to Season 6, essentially for the rest of this season, Daryl does his standard heroing, up until the introduction of Negan during the season finale. Season 7 has Daryl becoming a prisoner enslaved to Negan, suffering torture and various forms of abuse for weeks on end. It's not exactly an easy street for him at this time. He personally feels responsible for Glenn's death after not listening to Negan, so this is a massive weight on his shoulders even after Maggie forgives him. Season 8 comes around, and this is where Daryl and Rick clash a bit. Their relationship is tested in the aftermath of the Saviors, and things are a bit rocky, which leads us to the climax of Rick leaving the show in Season 9. 6 entire years go by where Daryl secludes himself from everyone. He lives out in the woods while spending day after day looking for Rick's dead body or his reanimated corpse. Yeah, not exactly a good few years for Daryl. Season 11 steps on in, as does Daryl's caretaking role for the former Whisperer, Lydia. Papa Daryl rears his head once again, and Lydia, along with a new character, Leah, help bring Daryl back to sanity. Daryl finally has a love interest, someone he can open up to and finally receive the love he needs, and never mind. Season 11 concludes the series and kills off Leah. Better to have loved and lost than not have loved at all? With that summary over, what are we taking a closer look at today? What are we going to put under the psychological lens? First and foremost, Daryl is a child of abuse and a broken family, so what does this mean for his well-being? Second, what would having an influential older brother with shifty views do to someone? Third, what does isolation do to the human mind? Next, how does the loss of loved ones alter us? Lastly, what are the psychological impacts of a full-blown zombie apocalypse? Let's begin, shall we? So, how does scientific research study something like child abuse? Well, most scientific studies differentiate types of abuse into physical, emotional, physical neglect, emotional neglect, and sexual abuse. In a study conducted in 2021, researchers focused on how PTSD is associated with various forms of abuse. By surveying an inpatient facility, researchers were able to find in their sample that PTSD was correlated with all of the different forms of childhood maltreatment, except for emotional neglect. This could be because of the sample or dozens of other reasons, but for this study, this was their specific finding. Emotional abuse was found to have the strongest association with PTSD and was found to be a significant predictor of PTSD, whereas the other forms of abuse weren't necessarily related to PTSD severity. While a blurred picture is painted of the abuse Daryl and his brother have gone through, does he suffer from PTSD? And what exactly is PTSD? According to the National Institute of Mental Health, PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is something like a flight or fight response in those who have suffered a traumatic situation like abuse, or, the end of the world. But what does it look like? Well, someone who suffers from PTSD can suffer from flashbacks, distressing thoughts, and other physical signs of stress that can be triggered by any number of things like words, objects, or even situations that are familiar to the event in question, or even situations that are similar to the event in question. With Daryl, he's shown symptoms of being on edge, especially in the earlier seasons where he was a bit of a loose cannon. He's always had trouble sleeping, and he's notoriously closed off. Does that explicitly mean he has PTSD? Correlation does not mean causation after all. He is in the middle of an apocalypse, and just because you have symptoms doesn't mean you have a diagnosis. I do believe he suffers from PTSD from his childhood and from the current situation of the world based on what we've seen. Especially in the earlier seasons, we see a lot of evidence of Daryl being reclusive and expressing exaggerated feelings of blame towards himself and others. It's hard for him to allow himself to open up to groups of people and to side with anyone. Even in the current series with Book of Carol, Daryl prefers to keep his emotions to himself and won't open up to Carol or his new love interest in the series. Again, I don't want to jump to conclusions and say it's because of his childhood. I'm much more attached to the idea of, why should he open up? Everyone he's loved has been killed. Merle, Sophia, Beth, Glenn, Carl, Connie, Leah. He has every right to want to push people away, really. During his hallucinations, it's explicitly made clear that Daryl doesn't have any self-worth. He doesn't see himself as someone of value even at the end of the world. Despite these thoughts, deep down inside him, he doesn't truly believe this, otherwise he would have let it all end there. No, he pushes through his injuries. He staggers himself back to his community because he knows it's where he belongs, despite immediately being shot by Andrea as he stumbles back to the camp. But don't worry, there aren't any hard feelings between them.
Third time you pointed that thing on my head. You gonna pull the trigger or what? I was kidding. Come on.
Daryl opens up to Lydia in Season 9, Episode 10, Omega, when he shows knowledge of how abusive parents operate, giving sympathy to Lydia when he realizes that the girl has been abused by her mother, Alpha. This trauma has built Daryl to be a resilient character, a trait that will come up a lot in psychology. This simply means that with high resiliency, one can recover from a traumatic event quicker and has a higher capacity for said trauma. They are still affected, but not as likely to, shall we say, suffer a PTSD episode. Now, what about growing up with someone who has negative views about groups of people who aren't like themselves? Without leaning too much into a stereotype, Daryl is from northern Georgia, a state that has a prominent history of racial oppression even in this day and age. His brother has expressed blatant racial and misogynistic prejudices before. Think back to Season 1 where he would spit out racial insults to Glenn, T-Dog, and Morales. Can't forget his treatment of Andrea either. We will just kind of assume here that their father also had a similar enough character. Well, right off the bat, we can assume that these views were passed down either from parent to child or from their surroundings. There are potential psychological reasons as to why racism exists, be it personal insecurity, flaws in compassion, projection flaws, poor mental health, and plain hatred or fear. With the Dixon family, there is certainly a lack of compassion. When Daryl went missing, his father didn't even notice. There's not much warmth between the two brothers, despite their tight bond with one another either. one only begins to feel compassion for others who they regularly associate with, and in the Appalachian Mountains of Georgia, especially in the 80s, only about 7% of the population identified as black, so it would be easy to believe that a majority of people Daryl spends his time with are his family and his business associates, which would most likely all be a similar type of person, white, lower-class men. Interestingly enough, a child who does not share the same values as their providers can suffer psychological trauma despite not being the victim of racial bias themselves. The constant coping of this everyday discrimination is an activator for our body's stress response. While some stress is healthy, not a lot of it is. While the focus of a majority of studies are aimed at the ones on the receiving end of this discrimination, a similar reaction can be found in the children of racists, who are powerless to stop their guardians' views while also being aware enough to realize the discrimination of their parents' acts. This can make the child feel caught in between, where they don't agree with what their guardian is saying, yet they can't call them out on their behavior at the risk of abuse or other neglect. It's easy to see why Daryl is so soft-spoken and a lone wolf throughout the entirety of this series. He's never really been able to voice or express his thoughts because those closest to him would either belittle him for his ideas or outright abuse him. Much to the pleasure of fans, Daryl learns to overcome this silenced nature. He often speaks up for those who are getting unfair treatment in the show and is frequently a voice of reason. It's been amazing to see his character learn to grow and accept a new family filled with people who are willing to do the right thing. Well, most of the time, that is. Now, how about the isolation Daryl faced as a child and as an adult? His childhood wasn't filled with a wide cast of people. It was primarily just Daryl, his dad, and Merle. In the series, he spends years out by his lonesome. It's no surprise that being isolated from other humans is one of the worst things you can do to a person that doesn't involve direct physical harm. Why is it that people can literally go insane after spending too long in solitary confinement? For children specifically, COVID-19 was a prominent example in showing us how isolation can affect our minds and body. Even at 7 years of age, children with high levels of loneliness have an increased likelihood of PTSD symptoms and face problems like depression, anger, and suicidal ideation. In all stages of childhood and adolescence, there is a correlation between loneliness and depression. In just 2 weeks, there can be a big spike in anxiety and depression. This is what we saw during COVID. Now, imagine being left by your lonesome for weeks or months on end with nothing but trees and wild animals around you. On one hand, it sounds like utmost peace, but that can quickly turn into paranoia and depressive episodes. Not only that, this lone wolf nature that Daryl takes on can also negatively impact his physical health. This includes increased chances of cardiovascular and metabolic diseases as he ages. Think back to his childhood, a time where we are most susceptible to cognitive and social development. Being a child without much social interaction can make for a lower IQ, poor language development, and a lack of social skills. Studies have evaluated the levels of cortisol in children with heightened levels of isolation and found that social isolation does increase cortisol levels, the hormone that affects nearly every organ and tissue in our bodies. High levels of cortisol for long periods of time can lead to a weakened immune system, depressive episodes, and even weight gain. Luckily for Daryl, he seems to be doing just fine in the health department, even if he's a little stinky man sometimes. As for his IQ, while he's not the most book smart, he is easily one of the smartest characters that we see in the show. Not only does he know how to hunt, track, and shoot multiple forms of weapons, including an RPG, he is also a mechanic, involves himself in local politics, becomes the leader of the Saviors for a brief stint, and even learns ASL and how to train a dog. I think this is an impressive resume, even in a non-apocalyptic world. Moving on to some of the more heartbreaking events of the show. What does the loss of a loved one do to someone's mental health? Daryl has lost just about everyone he cares about. Ready for a Walking Dead roll call? Dale, Merle, Andrea, Herschel, Beth, Tyrese, Glenn, Sasha, Carl, Tara, Henry, Enid, Connie, Leah, and Isabel, just to name a few, and trust me, there are plenty more. This happens nearly every season. Every year that the crew survives, they have to go through at least one main character death a year, it seems. While they aren't blood related, in times like this, these people are all you have. They become your adopted family in the apocalypse. With each new member, there is a sense of hope, and with each loss of one, that flicker of hope dies out. When a loved one unexpectedly dies, there is the obvious that happens: a higher risk of depression, anxiety symptoms, and a greater risk for substance use. But other long-term effects can come from these losses, like having a social phobia where one may close themselves off from new experiences and seek out solitude, which may ultimately make the situation worse, such as when Rick departs from the show. Daryl shuts himself out of the community and lives out in the woods alone in order to search for Rick's body for at least 6 years. 6 years is a crazy long time. Sure, he has the occasional visitor like Carol, but imagine living 6 years in a camp with no running water or electricity and sleeping on the floor for that entire time. Don't get me wrong, I love camping, but for a weekend or a week at most, I need a shower. A toilet? Oh, you mean the little hole in the ground that I have to dig every few days just so I can pop a squat and use poison oak for toilet paper? Yeah, no thank you. An interesting perspective Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor gives is that grief is a form of learning. When someone is taken from you unexpectedly, or even when you expect it, you have to figure out, how do I live in this world now? You learn to carry this absence with you. You learn which habits you have to change. It's a whole relearning experience. There was an interesting study done at the University of Colorado Boulder where neuroscientist Zoe Donaldson studied voles, an animal that mates for life, and took a look at how their brain changes when the mate passes on. They found that when a bond is initially made, the proteins folding in the nucleus accumbens, which is a part of the reward network of the brain, actually change. These neurons are what fire when voles approach their mate. As the bond gets stronger, more and more neurons fire, showing just how important the function of seeking out their mate is and why spending time with them gets so many resources of the brain. When a mate dies, however, there are cortisol increases. Dopamine and oxytocin try to pick up the slack to help motivate the animal. There are neuronal changes. There are neuronal changes that occur as the animal tries to figure out what happened. Although humans have an additional 2 pounds of brain and are much more complex than voles, it goes to show that the brain truly has to go through an update and change its mechanical processes. It takes time, and for Daryl, he's always experiencing loss. His brain is always going through this remolding process, and after a while, it's not at all surprising to think of how easy it could be to just not let anyone in again. With all that being said, this leads us to our next segment, the zombie apocalypse. While never truly confirmed of how the virus started, there are potential origins of why the first outbreak took place. It's been suggested to be space spores or a human-made virus, but even so, the creator of the series has confirmed that about 1.6 million humans in total worldwide, quote, initially made it out alive, meaning about 95% of the population was killed. Roughly 65,000 of those would be in the US, end quote. As of 2023, the population of Rhode Island, the smallest state in the country, was about 1 million. Imagine, there are maybe only about 1,000 people in your entire state or territory. For someone like Daryl, who already has a pretty small social circle, this would still be just as difficult for him. No matter where you go, you may not encounter anyone for weeks to months on end, especially as the apocalypse continues and more casualties happen. As you can imagine, nothing good can happen to your mental health in a situation like this. Even if it's not the grief, PTSD, or depression that gets you, the chronic stress of living in an active zombie apocalypse would get to you. If we are following the Walking Dead rules, you'd be living with a constant panic for 15 plus years. Whether out of fear of zombies or your fellow survivors, psychosis can kick in, and the next thing you know, you're hearing voices, hallucinating things that aren't there, and always fearing what could be coming around the corner. Don't forget, you're gonna have to be killing people and zombies alike. And believe it or not, there have been plenty of studies conducted on the impact of killing and injuring other people. And as you can guess, taking the life of another human does nothing positive to your mental health. In short, killing is significantly associated with PTSD symptoms, alcohol abuse, anger, and relationship problems. If that wasn't enough, with constant headaches, insomnia, muscle tension, and gastrointestinal issues, you're somewhat of a ticking time bomb. Specifically for Daryl, I believe he would be at the most risk for drug and alcohol abuse and depression. Luckily, we get some info from Norman Reedus in his interview with Entertainment Weekly. He states how Daryl was a person who, quote, doesn't want to do drugs. I want to be the guy that grew up with the drugs and hates the lifestyle that comes with having a druggy brother, end quote. He wasn't interested in drugs before the apocalypse, so he certainly won't be now. Even if this wasn't the case, it would be a lot harder to find supplies like drugs and alcohol in the apocalypse. While booze can have a long shelf life, the creation and distribution of drugs would probably collapse, so at least there's that. So, what do you think? Does Daryl measure up to this assessment? Given his circumstances, I think Daryl has adjusted pretty well, and this isn't even touching his whole country-hopping kidnapping story arc. Daryl has plenty of moments in the show where he showcases his trauma and has become an icon for many of his fans. His emotional breaks are a standout in the series and showcase how much his character has evolved over the years. There's a reason why Norman has over a dozen nominations for Best Supporting Actor and Best Male TV Star. Is there anything I missed in my assessment? Please feel free to comment below. The Walking Dead has been going on for nearly half of my life, so there are hundreds of hours worth of content that I can't cover, not even mentioning the comics. This is just the start of the series, so if there are any other characters from media or film you'd want to discuss, feel free to leave any recommendations below. Once again, I'm Moon, and this has been Psychology Unbound with Daryl Dixon. See you next time.